Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and we're here today with Allison Pugh, who is a professor of sociology at Johns Hopkins University and also the author of a couple books. The most recent book is called The Last Human Job, The Work of Connecting in a Disconnected World. And you have a couple other books. You have this one, Longing and Belonging, Parents, Children, and Consumer Culture. And then another one I don't have, which is called Tumbleweed Society. But with that title, it's something I'm going to have to hunt down and acquire because it sounds pretty cool. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, look, this book, Last Human Job, it's fascinating for me because it touches on a lot of the domains that I teach. And we've seen how automation has come for physical labor, right, with robots and so forth, and it's continuing apace. And we've also seen how, with the latest generation of AI, it's coming for the knowledge work that a lot of people thought was going to be immune to automation. And so a lot of people think, well, what's left, right, for us humans? Right? What can we do better than the machines? And I think you have focused your inquiry on what you call connective labor. And so a lot of people in the AI world talk about how, well, our unique strength as humans is our empathic capacity, right? And now, of course, everyone in the AI world is talking about how, well, not so fast here. Maybe they're better at that even than we are. And so I think that's the topic, one of the topics of your book. I think your book is aiming to really define this category of work, understand why it's so important, and why it's not as easy as you might think, not just to automate, but also to systematize, to quantify, and to apply all the Moneyball techniques that we've been applying to just about every other area of the workforce. So I guess maybe to start off, how did you come up with this concept of connective labor? I mean, it certainly there's other people that have tried to kind of circumscribe these types of jobs, but how did you come up with this concept, and how do you think about it as different from other work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question. It's a terrific summary. Yeah, I came up with the term because the existing terms seem to really focus on the individual. So connective labor, just for your listeners who may not have read the book yet or seen whatever talks.
They will.
Is really about the practice of seeing the other and having the other feel seen. And I came up with that after years of research and talking to, scores of people who do a whole bunch of different kinds of humane interpersonal service work, like therapy or even teaching, primary care, chaplains. The list is really long. And so I talked to those people for years and watched them, observed them while they were doing it and getting trained, et cetera, and really saw that that was a relational practice. It depended not just on what the individual was good at, had skills for, was able to do on their own in some kind of vacuum, but it actually was something that, the seer and the seen did together. And so I wanted to capture that kind of reciprocal relational process. And so that's why I came up with connective labor. The other terms that, are kind of out there, like I'm thinking most particularly about like emotional intelligence or EQ, that's all really, kind of located inside the person. And it's all about like, how good are your EQ skills and what's your EQ or whatever. And there's almost no relevance for the other person there. And that's just doesn't reflect what I saw. And ultimately, that has enormous implications for what you talked about at the start about AI and automation, because you probably can automate anything that a human can do, but you can't automate a relationship between two human beings, kind of by definition.
Well, I mean, it seems like connective labor, although there are folks for whom that makes up the most important part of their job, it does seem like there are a lot of other occupations that require at least some element of
Oh,
it. I
yeah.
mean, I worked as a waiter,
Oh, yeah. Waiters,
and
for sure.
and like there's yes, of course you're not a therapist, right? You're not a chaplain, but it does seem like the experience, however fleeting, is better
Yeah.
both for both parties if there's an element of connection, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the list goes on and on. And it was actually kind of a joyful part of my research because I kept seeing it everywhere. So, your hairdresser, your coach, your personal trainer, but also management. Like, you're not going to be a good manager unless you see the employee, see what they're good at, see where they need help, see whatever, and then communicate that seeing to them. That's part of kind of emotionally astute managing today. And there's been good research that shows that the US economy is moving from a thinking economy to a feeling economy. And there's a kind of debate among labor economists about whether that's because we have new jobs, that didn't exist before. I think one is like, party animator or, social media influencer, things that didn't exist before. Or is it because jobs that did exist before have more feeling in them, feeling required of them? And the answer is both. And so that means, your lawyer has to, on some level, see you. Your real estate agent has to see you to be able to, do good work. And yeah, so it's everywhere, is what I want to say.
But it seems like the demand for professional providers of this type of work is going up because the presence of this sensibility in other areas is going down, right? I mean, at my university, the demand for psychiatric services has just gone through the roof. I mean, when
Yeah.
I was in college, I mean, there were no psychiatrists on staff, and now they're booked 24/7.
Right.
I mean, it could be in part because the kind of, I don't know, lighter touch version of it is disappearing when you get your food delivered through an app instead
Right.
of getting it delivered from somebody in a face-to-face interaction. It creates, I think, a need for more connection. I think your work is touching on some of these broader topics in society about loneliness and lack of connection.
Yeah. I mean, that's I completely agree on some level that I actually don't consider it really a loneliness crisis so much as a depersonalization crisis where we like feel invisible increasingly, feel unseen, feel like a number. And that's going to come not just from screens, although screens are definitely going to contribute to that, but also from living in a standardized world where you are getting, kind of what fits for a lot of people. And you're like, but hey, wait, and that feeling of invisibility or just being reduced to a mass experience, that kind of contributes to this feeling of loss and alienation that is widespread. So I do think people are lonely for sure. Um, but I think just calling it lonely doesn't capture some of what I think are the inputs, the things that are shaping it. And the other thing I want to say to what you just said, like, is that, the expansion of mental health needs, for example. Um, it's a depersonalization crisis, but also one could argue that there is a desire for more, to be seen more than, say, 150 years ago, And the question is, what does that come from? I think some of it comes from feeling unseen, but also some of it might be a cultural trend of kind of a primacy of attention, and being known feels like it's important. And these are things that I don't think it's like a universal biological need that, was the same 3,000 years ago. I think we might be in a different cultural space where that kind of feeling feels more important now.
Well, it could be due to decline in religion to some degree, right? So
Uh-huh.
one if you're religious, then you feel that there's at least some entity that understands you and sees you 24/7.
I would
And
also say it could be to the particular, like it could even, if we're getting into religion, it could be about kind of coming out from the Protestant Reformation, because the difference between kind of standard Catholicism and what the Protestants promised in hundreds of years ago was that you would be known as an individual, and your responsibility for your personal relationship with God was on an individual level. So that kind of individualization of religion um, seems to feed into this phenomenon potentially.
yeah, well, I want to talk more about what it means to be seen. But
Yeah.
before we do so, I mean, I think there seems to be some concern that this will become a luxury good, right? Like having the attention I mean, if you go to visit a doctor now, and we're going to talk about this, I think the average doctor will see you for 7 minutes. And with telemedicine, maybe it'll be like 1 minute. And so the only folks that'll actually be able to spend time and take a deep breath with a doctor will be the wealthy. And that seems to also be driving a lot of the push towards maybe the virtualization of this. Maybe we can if we could somehow get people to feel comfortable with an artificial right, doctor, and it would give them the same feeling, then we can democratize it somehow, and then we can stave off the elitization or the inequality in attention that we would get otherwise.
Or do we actually, by doing so, do we kind of make freeze the existing inequalities? Because you're not talking about giving those services to the very wealthy. That's a very common, as I write in my book, it's a very common kind of sales pitch for a lot of the technology today, is that it's better than nothing. And so, well-intentioned people everywhere here are concerned about the inequality of access to, kind of, being seen at the doctor, being seen in the classroom, being seen, and with those kind of with the degradation of that kind of connective labor, where we're like loading more and more people on people's rosters, class in the classroom or in the clinic, people aren't getting seen as well, and the practitioners themselves are kind of being crushed by these loads, and then also being asked to collect data on these relationships
Yeah.
that they're supposed to be forging. And that is a little bit of a perfect storm. And so, of course, they're looking for relief. And of course, on some level, we're all hoping, like, surely there's some kind of solution here. But the solution that we're reaching for, the technological solution, often, that's like, asking us to do technologically what we refuse to do politically, which is put the funds so that low income people get access to people seeing them. And the idea that, the technology will be better than nothing, I am afraid will not lead to greater opportunities to be seen for less advantaged people. Instead, they'll just have machines seeing them, and the rich people get humans seeing them. And that's
Well,
an inequality that I find kind of tragic.
yeah, aren't there some people who now say that the AI seems more empathetic than the humans, right? So this is
Yeah.
not better than nothing, but the better than human argument.
Right.
The humans they're judgmental, they're impatient, they're not understanding, whereas this AI, wow, I mean, it's super patient, and it seems like we have a very strong capacity to anthropomorphize these things and forget that we're actually talking. I mean, on the one hand, it seems like we're talking to a human, but we also know that it's not a human, and so we're able to realize that it's not judging us. So
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think of that? What do you think of that evidence?
Yeah. I think it's, powerful, scary, important. We have to take it seriously. To me, it says more about our vulnerabilities to the technology that's being produced than viewing the technology as some kind of magic pill that will solve all our problems here. Our vulnerabilities, as you say, we think the machines aren't judging us, and so for some, better than the moral gaze of another human being is a computer that we can just tell our troubles and not worry about that. And
You hear people say they prefer
you're,
to drive in the Waymo as opposed to the Uber. Right? Now,
is that right?
in that case, I don't think it's because the Uber
No, that's
driver
not a
is
judging thing.
judging
Yeah,
them,
that's
but
like a
they
efficiency
might yeah, but they might demand some, I don't know,
interaction.
human contact, and
Yeah,
then people don't want that.
yeah,
Right?
exactly. That's a different thing. But the judgment thing, I think, is actually a really important. That to me, that's actually the strongest argument for automating these kind of services because I take those fears of judgment seriously. I think especially working class people are especially disadvantaged in, a whole variety of ways. Those people are, feel shame or vulnerability in front of, say, the primary care physician who's going to, kind of say, you need to stop drinking so much, or why aren't you eating more vegetables, or whatever, or the therapist who is going to be like, really? Now therapist, I talk to a lot of therapists and physicians, and they know that their judgment is scary, but they work very hard, to the ones I talk to work very hard to kind of mitigate them, or to kind of couch them in softer language, or to kind of hide behind, well, what do you want to change, that kind of thing. So there's definitely an explicit conversation about judgment happening among those professionals that I talk to. They know it's uh, a threat, but it also stems from the power of their expertise. And so it makes their opinions really matter. And that's a little bit of the problem with chatbots that are endlessly validating, is that on some level it's addictive for sure. Like, we've seen the rise of what's been called AI psychosis, where people kind of go down rabbit holes in the eternal validation of their ever increasing unusual beliefs.
Or
But
these AI boyfriends and girlfriends that
yeah,
tell you how awesome you are all the time, right?
yeah. And so, yeah, the but the thing I want to say is that the judgment of people who know, while scary, is also that which makes their seeing you more powerful. So there's something that the people who are escaping, trying to escape the human moral gaze, there's something they're losing out on, which is this very powerful experience of being seen by other people, other human beings who know. And a therapist, I've talked to a bunch of therapists about this in particular, and they're like, you know, they emphasize the relationship, that what people do in relationship with a therapist is work out the trust, the shame, the vulnerability with another human being, so that they can then take those capacities into the, what do you say, real world, into the world where other people are just regular people, not therapists. And so with chatbots, you're not really experimenting how to be with another human being. You're instead experimenting with a mirror. And that's just not going to have the same powerful impact. I would say one more thing, which is about friction. Um, they don't, you know, part of the relationship with another human being involves the friction of not being able to control what they say, of running up against their disagreement or conflict or even tension, or they have their own ideas, their own desires. And that's part of making our way through this world. And it's a really important part of being in community, in relationship with other human beings. And that's what chatbots don't give us. They give us no friction.
Well, it seems like what you describe as connective labor is it's a bit different from what people describe as right emotional labor.
Yeah.
In that emotional labor seems to be unidirectional, right?
Yes.
You're just in the service business, right?
Yeah.
Whereas connective labor seems to involve both parties, and
Right.
sometimes it benefits both parties, right? So the
For sure.
provider of the connective labor is actually achieving some level of fulfillment and satisfaction and purpose in this kind of labor, right?
Yeah. I mean, that was actually the beautiful part of this research was hearing about the impact of connective labor on of seeing the other. The impact on the seeing people, the people who are offering this to others is profound. So I found, I'm doing all this research, I'm talking to the people, I'm observing them. I can see that their work helps to create dignity, helps to create, kind of motivation in patients, helps to create understanding where, clients are, oh, now I see, I see all of those. But I also saw how it had those same effects on the practitioners themselves. So they themselves could feel their own humanity, their own kind of participation in this dignity project. They could also feel renewed and powerful sense of purpose from interacting with other people. They could feel like they have this kind of understanding of who they are in the enactment of these relationships and their values therein. So it was actually a very, uh, really kind of wonderful story to be able to tell about how the impacts go both ways. And may I say, it's also totally corroborated by a lot of psychological research and sociological research that I've kind of read, where people, if your well-being goes up, the more you, and there's the list is long, but if you text another person to tell them to check in on them, if you give a sincere compliment, if you listen, if you provide support, like really long list of people. There's research that shows that it actually has positive effects on not just your kind of mental well-being but also like physical well-being, like your blood pressure goes down or whatever, like there's actual health benefits from being a good soul.
Well, yeah, I mean, you talk about how, right, the patient or the recipient of these services, right, their anxiety is reduced and so forth. And I think some people would imagine that that resulted in the transfer of the
Uh-huh.
anxiety, right, to the practitioner. And certainly what we know about burnout seems to indicate that this is a possibility. I had a friend who was a therapist in a low income clinic, and she wound up killing herself. And of course she was already had presented with some psychological problems before this, but I think that type of work kind of put her over the edge. And so I think a lot of people would think that this is just kind of transferring the pain and the anxiety. But you show that you cite some research that has a very different impact on the provider of services.
Well, first let me say I'm so sorry to hear about that. It's so rough to be a witness to other people's pain, and you're doing that just by being her friend, but your friend also was experiencing that at work for sure. Um, I guess I would say, yeah, um, the research here, there's a ton of research on burnout, as you know. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the kind of workplace campaigns about kind of mitigating burnout appear to be really individually focused. So often it's like, make sure you take lunch and, uh, have
Do
you been
some
on
yoga.
do some yoga, arrange your mindset, have you
Right.
been on vacation lately, like, and I came to think that after talking to people for, 5 years about this stuff, it started to seem like people are actually fed by the work of seeing the other. They feel it's sustaining, meaningful work. It's very powerful work to be able to offer that to another person and have that land successfully, to do it well. And the problem is when they get overloaded, the problem is the working conditions of that work, not the work itself. So the problem is not that we're, listening to too much pain. It's that we're being forced to listen to the pain of like X number of people, and oh yeah, here, I'm sorry, you only get 15 minutes to do that. And by the way, you also have to like collect data on that and enter it into three different platforms, and have you also, and so it's just, that's the problem, not the work itself. And I want to really make that distinction. I think some burnout researchers are surely aware of this, but I think it hasn't translated, that insight has not translated well into how organizations address the burnout of their population, their, working populations.
Yeah, it's almost as if those folks who are working in those environments, they need to be seen as well,
Oh, yeah,
right?
for sure.
By their employer, right? Their employer needs to actually see what they're going through, see what they're doing, and appreciate the difficulties that they encounter.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that is true. And I did this. I actually was lucky enough to see some organizations that do it well, that do it right, that support the people within them, seeing the other, and kind of getting fed. Where that work is sustainable, and um, putting in kind of mechanisms for people to be seen by others is part of that. Is part of having a sustainable kind of high touch social architecture where people have like, what I ended up calling sounding boards, where they can talk to other peers about like, you know, any kind of difficulty that they're having, and mentors, and, kind of building in people to people relations to support the people who do the people to people work is actually part of making that functional.
Yeah, and it seems like part of the reason why they might burn out is not because they're spending so much time with these patients or clients and seeing them, but actually not being able to do it, right? It's the
Right.
obstacles to doing it that
Exactly.
is creating the problem.
Yes, exactly. I thought I kind of was like, we have the wrong metaphor for this. We're walking around with a metaphor of like, oh, I have a bucket of compassion and my bucket has holes or something like that. And actually, we should think of it like, kind of rain. And there's, it's a sustaining rain. We all need that rain. And sometimes the ground is too dry, and the ground, the condition of the ground, the capacity of the ground to handle the rain is shaped by the working conditions.
Well, look, I mean, we've seen this Moneyball movement spread across almost every type of work.
Yeah,
And as somebody who teaches in a business school, I mean, who can argue with trying to increase
sure.
productivity, trying to have measurable outcomes, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They say if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it. So what are the challenges with measuring and monitoring what people are actually doing in these jobs? I love this story about the chaplains having to go to the EHR and
Yeah.
EMR and put in like codes and stuff. I mean, why is this work so difficult to apply their Moneyball practices to?
Yeah. I mean, this was really the reason why I started the project in the first place, was the conflict between this kind of industrial logic and work that is about relationship. And we
Yeah, why
still
can't we just
have not
tailorize this
solved
whole
it.
thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
We have not solved this, so that it's like we have this hammer of industrial logic and we want to apply it to everything because it's worked so well, arguably, on kind of creating efficiencies in other things. Um, but we can't count this that well. I'm right now at a university that has an entire. I'm giving a talk. Yesterday, I gave a talk at a university that has an entire unit dedicated to kind of helping students belonging and improving climate, the climate of the university, that kind of thing. And they're being asked to assess their work, and they were like, "We don't know how to do that. How do you assess belonging? How do you assess trust?" You know, there are measures. People can ask. People can say, how, rate your level of belonging on a scale of 1 to 5. And it's just difficult to put a lot of kind of credence in those proxies for how much someone trusts someone, or trusts a university, or feels belonging. But also, it's like, what shapes that belonging? What are the ways to, kind of help a student or a client or a a patient or whatever, feel, get these gains, feel more purpose, feel more meaning, feel more motivation. These are things that really elude easy measurement. And people have spent a lot of time trying to capture it. I can remember, do you remember those? Um, I forget who it was who did it, but they used to plant $5 bills inside, in envelopes and put them on the street, and whether or not a person would pick it up and then put it in mail it was a sign of how much kind of, I don't know, social norms and kind of a strong social fabric in the community. These are kind of intangibles that I'll just say we need to be really creative in measuring, and they elude the easy, quantification that contemporary management fads really want them to have.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there are pros and cons to what you call scripting and what you call counting, and also what we might think of as division of labor. I mean, certainly I don't think anybody would argue that service quality would degrade if we could somehow take the most tedious parts of the job and outsource them, right? I mean, if the doctor has to spend all this time in front of a computer doing data entry instead of
Uh-huh.
talking to the patient, if we can automate that so that they can redirect their attention to the patient, I mean, that's got to be good all around, right?
I mean, you're describing the scribes. That's what happens. They're using AI scribes, and that's been, I would say, taking off like wildfire in across medical practices across the country. Um, you know, I hate to puncture the balloon, but I'm going to do it because, okay, first of all, I have total sympathy for the overburdened physician and their patients that are like, ah, didn't even look me in the eye. Like I hear that all the time. So for sure, there's a problem here. But is the problem that we, need some machine to take over that part of the doctor's job? Or is the problem downstream, or would it be upstream? Is the problem before that where we are asking the doctor to kind of basically chart in such a fashion? And the charting has also changed dramatically. So they're having to like kind of keep track of things that they didn't even do, like, or that they didn't even kind of wasn't part of the assessment of the patient. Did you? I had a doctor narrate this for me. He's like, "Did you check their eyes? Did you check their ears? Did you check their this?" And he's just like, and you have to. It's like someone else saying, "No, you have to check all of these," instead of my organic, holistic assessment of the patient and where they stand and what they need. And so that's the problem. So if we were more parsimonious, and this is actually applies not just to doctors, but to teachers for sure, and other kind of occupations, if we were more parsimonious about the data that we want to collect, we've been on like a data binge, and there's been no kind of limit to what we're asking people to do, and the people who are recording the data are the people in charge of the relationship. And because they're right there, they're the front line. They know what's happening. So yeah, just make them fill out this form. And that's why that's behind the thing that you mentioned, the vignette or anecdote that you mentioned that starts my book, where I'm following this chaplain, spiritual chaplain around a hospital, and she's having to take notes and upload data to 3 different platforms when nobody bills for what a chaplain does. So yeah, we've gone a little crazy on the data. So scribes, why, let me just say one thing about like, or a couple things about like why I'm puncturing the balloon about scribes. First of all, their rollout, has been imperfect. So I've had physicians come to me and be like, yeah, they use language that I would never use in writing a patient note. And I know patients now they're more common to see the notes. And so they see this very off-putting language. It's very judgmental, and I would never use that. And I feel bad. So I have to spend hours fixing how the AI wrote it or whatever. Undoubtedly, that's fixable. What's not fixable is the core fallacy that underlies so much of this discourse around AI, which is that it's going to free us up for more meaningful work. And actually, what happens is just more work gets
So
piled.
now the 7 minutes will become 3 minutes because they'll just say,
Exactly.
here, you got to do twice as many patients, right?
Exactly. And so it's a fantasy that employers will be like, oh, I'm so glad that Dr. Smith can now spend all that time that he was charting really in a deep conversation that we didn't find valuable or worth the time before, but now we do. It's just not what's happening. We have to actually value it first. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you also talk about checklists, right? So I'm a big fan, and I'm sure you are, of the checklist manifesto and everything. And we know how it can save lives and you can reduce error rates and so forth. But you can have some pathologies, right, with these checklists, particularly with the interpersonal interactions, which seem kind of robotic and impersonal. So, I mean, have we gone overboard on checklists?
I mean, can I say yes? Checklists, I think, have some utility. I have had practitioners say, like, they really have helped me especially when I don't know, something, so that, I've had, people talk about how and therapists say, like, yeah, it reminded me to ask about her father. If I had had this earlier, I would have gotten all that much earlier. It's actually kind of funny. But so they're important. I don't want to say they're not important. But what they do is they essentially standardize an encounter that relies on its idiosyncratic kind of particular detail to work. So
So maybe
if
take a look at the
someone
checklist before and then periodically just check it but to see if you
yeah,
covered all your bases.
yeah, use it as a kind of, like a little aid, but the closer it gets to a script, the less you're actually seeing the person in front of you, and they will perceive that inauthenticity, and it will kind of ruin it to some degree.
It'd be like going out on a date and somebody's like, okay,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
like just tell me about this aspect of yourself and so forth, right?
Yeah, I think there was this case where was it Trump? I think it was Trump. I can't remember who was the president, but at some point we there was a picture that captured a sheet of paper he was holding in his hand, and it was a checklist. And the first was like, we feel your pain, or we hear you," or something like that. Like
Right.
it was very
Make
it was a
sure you
script. Yeah.
yeah, that might not have been Trump. So but I mean, so you also talk about counting, right? And I mean, in a way, I mean, look, I teach data, and I don't want to think that more data is ever a bad thing. And I think the problem, the way I would think about it, is not that too much data is the problem, but rather that the focus on data forces us to ignore the things that are more difficult to measure, right? As if you can't measure it, it doesn't matter, and if it's measurable, then it matters. And that seems to be the biggest pathology with too much counting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that is an enormous comment. That is a profound statement because we've really bought into people think that it underlies everything, underlies capitalism, underlies our whole system of certainly work and also play. There are ways that we try and make everything more efficient. It's perhaps the uniquely American pathology, and yeah, we have to make space for um, kind of the human pursuits that are not easily measurable. And throughout our history, you could say that this tension existed, but there have been domains that refuse that are kind of strong enough to refuse, the call to efficiency. And so, kind of religion or spiritual life has been a really strong domain. I would say family has been a very strong domain of like, no, no, that doesn't belong here. But you can see the inroads taking place where you hear about the clergy that are using AI. You hear about families that are kind of spreadsheets are very common in, helping family, chart who's going to do what, or, like, it's like,
Priests
there's,
paid by the mass. It's like,
yeah, there's been like a
yeah.
kind of a porousness across these barriers where it kind of feels like no place is safe, and that industrial logic is becoming paramount to everywhere. And it worries me for sure.
Yeah, you had this description of a supermarket that had the inefficient checkout line. I thought that was kind of cool, right? Because most supermarkets are like, here is the express lane, and this is going to be the lane where the person behind the counter is going to talk your ear off, and people would get in that line. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of wild.
Yeah, I love that example. That was in Holland, where they have the chat checkout, and you can choose to do that. And I actually think we'll probably see more of that because it actually reflects. It fits right in with the industrial logic because it says if you don't mind and you just want efficiency, choose that and go that. And then if you do, we'll just parcel it out over here instead of making the inefficient, or I should call it really the humane and the interactive and the frictionful community building relationship is everywhere. Now, instead, it's a lane that we choose and not just at the supermarket.
Well, you had this great story about a friend of yours who, after graduating from medical school, went to work in rural Appalachia and then went to work in a kind of a wealthier urban environment. And she seemed to find challenges in both places, right? But different ones. And she sort of became burned out in the
In
rural
both.
area, but then found a different type of burnout almost in the urban area.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That was I loved that's one of my favorite chapters in the whole book. It's about Ruthie because her career, fascinatingly, kind of encompasses how we organize this labor, starting with her deep, abiding commitment to serving the underserved in Appalachia. And she goes full of ideals, and I'm just going to do this. And she finds it deeply meaningful, but eventually it just crushes her with too much need and not enough resources, and the working conditions basically ask too much of this dedicated individual. So she gives up after they give her this huge going away party, which is very meaningful, but she was just completely shredded by the experience. So she gives up, moves to a kind of well-resourced area where she's snapped up quickly by a practice that is kind of a more corporate model. So if the first model was a kind of mission based model, which you might see very common in public classrooms as well as public clinics, et cetera. Then you have the corporate model, and you'd think that would be great. She had a nice office, they had good lunch or whatever, but like it was also they were kind of trying to fit in as much as possible to maintain their profit, and then also the people that she was serving were quite demanding, as kind of a more affluent or advantaged population can be. So they're like, I have this, and can you give me a prescription for that? Thanks so much. Like she didn't feel the deep service that she had experienced in the prior in Appalachia. So she gives up there. Also, she was burnt out there. Also, went to a conference about burnout and was like, we're losing a medical class of doctors a year on burnout to suicidality, and so she ends up opening her own practice. And it's a members only practice. So it's similar, but not the same as a concierge model. So her model was the concierge model is really, aimed at serving rich people. And they have tiny rosters, and it's very artisanal what they're offering you, and they really focus on what you need. And it's a deep seeing. Their connective labor is outstanding, but it's quite it poses what I wrote about it, that it poses a kind of existential kind of cost of am I a servant, essentially, because you're just serving the you know extreme extreme wealthy. Now, Ruthie's a slightly different case. Hers is called direct primary care. So it is for a more reduced rate and it's for a wider population. And I've talked to her since then, and she's very happy. She does, kind of control how many people she sees, and she serves them for longer, has more time with them. But I don't think that's a model that works across the United States. It doesn't serve the very poor. We're still compartmentalizing who gets what. Um, and probably this is, smarter people than me can solve this, but probably this has a lot to do with the fee for service approach to medical care, where people have to kind of stuff as many as they can to be able to even survive as a practice.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that fee for service model, like the economics of the industry, it sort of downgrades the role of the general practitioner. And
Absolutely.
yet but they're the ones that actually, I mean, it seems like they're the ones that have the most
Relationship.
interaction with, yes,
Yes.
they're the ones that have the, and if you want to get rich as a doctor, you're going to be like an
Right.
orthopedic surgeon.
Right.
You're not going to be a general practitioner. They're the
Right.
ones that are going to get the burnout. But it seems like for the orthopedic surgeon, you might not actually need as much connective labor, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I mean, I've only had surgery once in my life, and I saw him for like 3 minutes before I was unconscious.
Right. Right.
Like
Right.
so,
Right.
like they don't need to have a lot of connection, but the front facing, the person that actually gets to know the patient, it seems like we underappreciate their role, and as a result, they're kind of undercompensated relative to the specialists. I mean, do we
Yeah.
need to re reevaluate how we reward these people within the system?
I mean, for sure, we're not the first to say that. What I think is actually really interesting about this moment is that if it and we don't know how this is going to kind of shake out. But if AI turns out to be really good at, say, pattern recognition, but not so great at helping people kind of control their behavioral medicine, like not have so much sugar or whatever, like the doctors will say you need a relationship with another human being to provide that motivation, to provide that purpose, et cetera, that will help people manage more chronic conditions. And that's what the primary care relationship does, and that's what it's for. So if we're not able to really automate that, but we are able to automate the more expensive specialties, it does feel like we are going to see we potentially could see a shakeup in the compensation that are due to doctors, because what will be precious, what humans will add is that relationship. And what is automated is this other stuff that other highly paid professionals do, not necessarily orthopedic surgeons, but, some of, say radiologists or, pathology or something like that. And so it's kind of interesting that shakeup, there could be a shakeup. And I talked to a radiologist, a while ago, who was facing this, actually, who was kind of saying, we need to adjust. We need to become more public facing, because that's where the human value is going to be. And who owns the public facingness? Who owns the public patient? That's the primary care physician. So it does feel like a recalibration of this value feels imminent. But what's imminent? Could be 10 years or something like that. But it does feel like there is going to be some recalibration for sure.
Well, I mean, I think one of the emphases in your book is this notion that there's a social architecture of connective labor, right? That in order for this connective labor to happen, there has to be, right, an organizational structure. There have to be resources, right? There has to be some intentional design around the workflow. And so, I mean, can people who are teaching management, can they maybe import some of this into what they're doing? I mean, is this something that we in business schools should be thinking about? Like, how can we teach managers to understand the importance of connective labor and the environment, how the environment needs to be constructed differently for this type of labor as opposed to other labor?
Yeah, I think that would be fabulous if business schools took this work seriously. And they should, because it's not just therapists, teachers, and doctors who do it, but it's managers. And so if business schools are in the process in the business of teaching managers how to manage, this is one of the things they need to take seriously. Now, um, if business, what you're kind of describing is more almost at a kind of CEO level, or like kind of a maybe founder level, like people kind of trying to create the organization from the ground up. And for that, I would love them to take those principles seriously. The most important one, maybe, or at least I won't say the most important, one of the most important ones is the distribution of material resources. So that's like time, space, money. So that's like, do you pile on the roster? Do you have a business model that allows people to actually have enough time to see the other? That's really in the most baked in fundamentals of kind of founding an organization. The other stuff I think is more easier to adapt in an existing organization, like for example, the mentoring or the sounding boards, or kind of perhaps most challengingly, the biggest challenge will be in producing a kind of authentic connective culture. I heard from so many practitioners about inauthentic ones. One teacher was like, yeah, my principal gave me a list of top 10 or no, 25 tips on how to connect to your students. And he tacked it onto the men's restroom, essentially. And that's not achieving a good connective culture. That's like kind of hoping they get it while they're doing something else, But that teacher was like, "Well, when are we going to do it? We have so much professional development already." And the point is, you have to make it a priority. You squeeze out other things so that this is what you talk and write and enact. So I spoke to other principals who told me all the ways in which connecting and relationality and making space for the other was built into their practices, from they called it like restorative justice circles, and how the teachers greet the student every day, and they would have retreats where they'd be like, how do we enact this in science, how do we enact this in math, so that's not necessarily the business school case, but it's useful to think about how connective culture has to kind of be threaded throughout a business organization, and not just kind of tacked on like 25 tips in the restroom.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about it in both ways, in the sense that if you are managing a hospital, right, then you
Yeah,
need
yeah,
to
yeah.
think about doing this. But I was thinking in the broader sense that while you mentioned chaplains and coaches and teachers and doctors, I mean, I do think that a fundamental part of being a manager, right, if you're managing a team of people, is to have this capacity for connection, because the things that your employees are going through and the things that they're doing, they want validation, they want purpose, they want to be seen, they want to be understood, and the only people that can really understand them, specifically around the challenges that they're facing, are their managers and their coworkers, right? You can't go to a therapist and say, "Wow, man, that expense reporting stuff is driving me crazy." Or
Well,
whatever.
yeah, but it would be a short conversation.
Oh man, the this person over here is toxic or whatever. I mean, you want your boss to be the one that is capable of listening. And I think a lot of the people who get burnt out at work are getting burnt out because they don't feel heard at work, and being heard outside of work is inadequate compensation for what they're craving.
Yes, I mean, I totally agree. I would also add that when people have a chance to kind of express their values at work, figure out who they are and have their values kind of enacted in their work and kind of basically attach a purpose to what they're doing, a more transcendent purpose than just kind of earning the paycheck. It translates into a kind of deep meaningfulness. And that's part of the outcome of connective labor. And so it's really worth it for managers to get good at this because it enables people, the people they're seeing, to figure out what matters to them and to find that in relationship at work. That's a path to meaningfulness that can be very important.
Well, last question, which also has to do with education, right? You talk about connective labor as kind of an artisanal practice. And
Yeah.
when I hear that term, what that means to me is that it's not something you can learn very easily from a textbook. It's something that you have to learn by doing. Now, look, maybe there's some people that are born with all these wonderful capacities and skills, but even they can benefit from some experience. If it requires kind of learning by doing, then can this process be more intentional than accidental? And if so, is there a concern that by getting rid of internships, I had another podcast with Matt Bean, and he was talking about how within the medical professions, right, the interns are more or less disappearing, right? They have to go to simulators because they're not welcome in the operating room because they're going to slow things down, reduce productivity. So, I mean, I know in the world of counseling, right, you have to do a certain number of hours as interns. But there, I think the idea is that you just kind of are supposed to learn just by doing it rather than by shadowing somebody or getting some kind of training. How can we transmit best practices for this artisanal practice?
So
Is there,
interesting. Such a great question and so important right now because it's not just in the medical field that interns are disappearing, but in consulting. You keep reading, you know, news stories where people are eliminating interns because that's what AI does well. So we have to, if we're going to eliminate interns, we have to rethink how people get trained, and that's also true for connective labor. So I think that's a really smart question. I suppose I think that right now, for example, therapists, one of the things I spent all my time doing in this research was watching therapists get trained. And so in at least the setting I was at, would they would work, grad students in psychology would work in a free clinic where people could get free marital therapy or whatever, and then that would be videotaped. And then they would they would sit with the supervisor. The supervisor would watch the video with them and be like, well, did you think about saying this? Or what if you said this? That's not, when he says something like this, you should really think about, deep, close training, a lot of feedback right, in the moment.
I'm
And
surprised they had time to do this, right? Because now that labor is being, right, squeezed out.
yeah, but that's what training psychology, professional psychologists is. That's what that training is. And so, yeah, is that disappearing? Like so on one level, people are getting free, like that's the trade-off. They know they're getting seen by trainees, that it might not be super professional, it might not be done by people with outstanding skills yet, but it's also free. And they are probably, they're getting this supervised, so they can't do absolutely terrible things to you. Um, and so that's been the model. And probably we all experience that when we go to the hospital on July 15th and, the brand new interns are there as of July 1. We watch people get trained in this all the time. And I don't know the future. It seems like replacing that, automating the intern, because that's what AI can handle well, does seem to eliminate some crucial ladder steps. And I don't know how we go from one to the other. It does perhaps put more pressure on schools to be a site for that. But I don't know how schools do it because you can't teach it from a textbook. Absolutely not.
Yeah. Or one would think that they're going to come up with some AI simulations, right? Where you,
Yeah,
you deal with fake patients and then the patients are going to be dealing with the fake therapists. And
it's
then,
true.
right. So anyway, Allison, this is a really wonderful book. I really enjoyed it. And it's called The Last Human Job, the work of connecting in a disconnected world. Check it out.
Thank you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.